Hi, I'm Andy Yost, an attorney with the Children's Bureau's Capacity Building Center for Courts, and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Dana Weiner, Child Welfare Policy Researcher at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. And we're here today to introduce to you the topic of being an everyday scientist. These are two words that you might not hear that often in your normal day-to-day life, everyday and scientist. Normally when we think about science or scientists, they're sort of austere folks, maybe not the kind of person you want to have at a Christmas party. They're often some laboratory together, dressed in stark white outfits, and they're cooking up very kind of closed system experiments, experiments that give us interesting insights but are maybe hard to replicate in the quote-unquote real world. What we'd like to talk to you today about is the idea of being an everyday scientist. That is, bringing the scientific method out of the laboratory and into our professional environment. To get a sense of what that actually means, being an everyday scientist, we're going to hear from Dr. Dana Weiner.
So we think an everyday scientist is someone who is naturally curious about who they're serving, what that population needs, what interventions might be helpful, and why those things might work or not work. We also think an everyday scientist is resourceful and creative in thinking about what data and information and methods might be available to them to answer some of those questions. And third, we think everyday scientists are experimentally minded, willing to take risks and test theories and possibly learn some unexpected things.
So the person that you just described, to me, sounds like a pretty intelligent person. And in some ways, it might even sound intimidating to say, oh, I need to cultivate inquiry inside myself. But as I listen to you talk, what I actually think I heard you say is we do this just in our normal lives. So for example, let's say I'm gardening and I have some tomato plants that just won't grow, or the tomatoes are green but they won't turn red. The everyday scientist in me says, well, why aren't they turning red, right? What's the problem that I have in front of me? And then I start to hypothesize ideas about why they might not be turning red. Maybe they're getting too much water. Maybe they're getting too little water. Maybe there's some bugs that are eating them before they have a chance to turn red. The point is that I have a number of theories about what might actually be causing the problem. Those are the first couple steps in a scientific method. Third, I might say to myself, well, I'm going to do something about it, right? I'm going to spray, I won't actually, my tomatoes are going to be delicious, but someone might spray pesticides on their tomatoes, or they might water them more, water them less. In other words, they have an intervention and they see whether or not what they do actually affects the change that they want. And then of course they watch to see whether or not the tomatoes actually turn red. So there's this kind of evaluation of whether or not your intervention actually worked.
Exactly. So if this sounds good or interesting, how can people become everyday scientists? And we've talked a lot about this and how people might kind of evolve to be everyday scientists. So some of the things we've talked about are this idea of cultivating inquiry, thinking in terms of questions and articulating those questions and making them explicit so that you can go about answering them. So developing questions that can be answered using data and evidence, identifying reliable and valid data sources that can be put to answering those questions, and also understanding the potential action implications of what you might learn. So one of the questions we often pose as researchers is, what would you do if you knew? Some of the questions we have are just for curiosity's sake, but in our systems we really care about the questions that have implications for action.
So we've painted a picture for you of the austere scientist in a laboratory and also kind of the mundane scientist in their backyard garden. And what I'm hearing you describe is sort of a professional space in between those two things. So there is a way to be a bit more rigorous than the everyday gardener, but maybe a little less rigorous than the professional scientist. So what might that look like in a professional context? Let's imagine, just for the sake of the conversation, that you're an attorney, that you're a children's attorney. And you have concerns that in your jurisdiction, or maybe even just in your own courtroom, the voices of children are not being heard. What would you do as an everyday scientist to evaluate whether or not that's a problem and then do something about that problem? Well, the first thing that you'd want to do is decide whether or not the data lines up with the problem that you think is actually going on. And that doesn't have to be anything highly technical or sophisticated. Just get out a piece of paper, a tally sheet. Every time you go into court, write down the day that you're in court and whether or not your child client was present or a child client was present. And if they were, whether or not the judge asked them what they thought, whether or not their voice was heard. And pretty soon what you'll see is that you have a rough and ready set of data that you can use to determine whether or not your theory actually lines up with what's happening in practice. Now let's imagine that it is the case that children's voices are not being heard in your jurisdiction or in your particular courtroom. What's the everyday scientist do next? Well, they come up with an intervention. They come up with some idea or some strategy that they might implement to affect the change that they want. So in this case, you could do a couple of things. You could either make sure that each time you come to court, you're prepared to articulate what the child's client wishes are, or you could actually bring the kid to court if it's appropriate. And then watch and see what happens. This is the next step in the everyday scientific method. Watch and see what happens. Does the judge address the child client? Does the judge make different decisions based on the fact that the child client was there? How do the other parties' behavior change? So the idea is that you watch to see whether or not any change actually happens as a result of your intervention. And of course, whether it does or doesn't is going to matter, and you can adapt or tinker with your intervention to try to get the change that you want. But that's just an example of kind of being in between the rigorous sense of science that we normally think of and maybe the looser sense of science that we were thinking of as gardeners.
Absolutely. And what Andy's just described is a plan, do, study, act cycle, which is a small test of change that you can incorporate into your everyday work or everyday life. It involves the third thing that we think you need to do to become an everyday scientist, which is to have a hearty interaction with data and evidence. And that means both consuming data and evidence, but also producing data and evidence responsibly. The other thing that this interaction involves is collaborating on interpreting what you learn. So we're not talking about just sitting at our desks looking at data and trying to understand it ourselves, but rather working with the people we really think are the experts, frontline staff, system stakeholders, to understand what the research evidence is telling us. So inherent in this hearty interaction with data and everything we're describing really are some challenges that you're likely to face. So we felt like it would be only fair to talk you through what we think you might expect that might be a little bit more challenging in your everyday scientist endeavor. The first of those is that you might learn some unexpected things. The data might disagree with your own beliefs, values, experience, or your understanding of the situation. And that willingness to kind of be challenged and to trust reliable and valid data and to potentially change direction based on something new that you learn is part of this process of engaging with data and evidence.
Even if the data that you have is not disagreeable, in other words, if the data does confirm what you think is the case, it may be the case that the data you have, despite its strength, isn't clean data or comprehensive data. In other words, it has gaps. Every data set is going to reveal some truth and at the same time conceal some truth. So the diligent everyday scientist is aware of this fact, and whenever they realize that there's a gap in the data that they have, you don't stop there. You just go out and collect some more data and continue to add context and sort of collateral information, supplemental information to really understand what's going on.
Absolutely. And the word that's coming to mind is patience. I think this everyday scientist thing requires a lot of patience. Also because we work in big, complicated systems. And the transformation of those systems, or even the implementation of small changes in response to the evidence that we are interpreting, can be slow and complicated and incomplete. And that's kind of another of the challenges that we've thought about in being an everyday scientist.
Yeah, good. So there's already a handful of challenges that are on the table, right? If the data disagree, if the data is incomplete, recognizing that, as you just said, that the change can come slow. Another challenge that you might run into is the difference, trying to address different kinds of challenges themselves. So for example, you often hear people talk about the difference between a technical challenge and an adaptive challenge. A technical challenge, it's not that technical. It sort of happens all the time. For example, if you can't get a document to load on your computer because you're missing a little piece of software, you just go download it, you plug it in, and all of a sudden you have a fix to your problem, right? Technical problems have technical fixes. But a lot of the problems that we deal with and that data reveal to us are adaptive challenges. Challenges that have a little more nuance, a little more subtlety, might require changes in people's behavior or attitudes as opposed to, or in addition to, a more technical fix.
And that's kind of a nice segue into our last challenge, which is that while the data may tell us who, what, where, when, how, it's much harder to have the data tell us why. And sometimes that requires approaches to research that are beyond the everyday scientist and require collaborations with researchers or more complex research designs to really get into our testing our theories of change and understanding why something worked or why it didn't work.
So then, to return to our central idea here of being an everyday scientist, it's important to keep in mind that to be an everyday scientist does not mean that you work in isolation. As Dana just said, it actually requires a community of scientific practitioners, or a community of people who are using this method that has a high level of rigor, but also has a high level of accessibility, that anyone can do it and we sort of do it already naturally in our world. So if I were you, I'd be asking myself, okay, this sounds great, now what? And my answer to you would be, go be an everyday scientist. The world itself is your laboratory. You don't need some closed off controlled environment. Your skills and ability as an everyday scientist allow you to be an agent of change in a very powerful way. Don't underestimate the value of a tally sheet, as sort of the shorthand way of saying that. Be curious, ask questions, gather data, make observations, and then do something about it. Implement a strategy. Rally your community around a solution that you've identified based on the research and observations that you've made. And most importantly, use the results or the findings of your experimentation to create the child welfare system that you really envision.
Now we invite you to explore this idea of being an everyday scientist further. It is my pleasure to introduce and moderate today's session on the role of leaders in developing a workforce culture that values data and evidence. Today, we'll hear the stories of 4 leaders drawn to our field for different reasons, but all grounded in the values of using data and evidence to understand problems, generate and test potential solutions, and improve outcomes. So through a series of conversations, you'll learn what drew these leaders to our field, how they seek to transform systems and implement change, and how they approach the inevitable barriers they encounter. Also, what keeps them invested in our shared pursuit of science in the service of our work. So Margot, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your why. What drew you to this work?
Well, I'm currently the acting deputy director for the San Diego County Child Welfare Services Department with oversight of our Policy and Program Support Division. And I actually came into the field of child welfare sort of by chance. I originally grew up wanting to be a law enforcement officer and had moved to California to find a job as a police officer. And so I came across a listing for a child abuse investigator. I had no idea what that entailed. And really, upon being hired, had no idea that children were abused and that families had their children taken away from them. So training was quite heartbreaking as I sat there and learned what this job really is. And I think that helped me develop a passion for the children and the families that we work with. I've really sort of tried to make it my mission to make the system a little bit better each day, whether it's simple things as approving policies that help our children and families or our social workers, or bigger macro issues such as system change. But I really am passionate about the work that we do.
Wonderful. So as a leader, what has been your role in helping to create the shift in perspective, facilitating kind of the aha moments that drive a hunger for data in the field?
So I think engaging all levels of staff is really, really important for any sort of system change and generating an interest around something. And so what I've told people as I've gone into more training of staff is that social work is a field where you really have to use your head, heart, and guts to make a difference. So when I first started over 20 years ago, data and evidence-based practice wasn't nearly as prevalent as it is, today. And so I think the field has evolved tremendously. 20 years ago, it still remains a human service field, but back then we really relied on, well, what do we think is the best for families without really knowing what the evidence or the data said to support that. And so reminding staff why it's important to use their head, heart, and guts, and that the using data is sort of the head part of it, and our heart, you can't get away from that. We're working with families, and having compassion and empathy is extremely important. And I think when you use all three of them together, you're more likely to be successful.
So tell us a little bit about the steps you've taken to initiate the changes that you've envisioned.
So one of the things that we've done specifically in San Diego County is to use data to address our long stayers, which are children that are active to the adoptions program specifically, that have been post reunification services for greater than 36 months. And we have currently at the time we started this, about 700 children in the program. And we had historically only looked at the length of time they had been in foster care in its entirety, not specifically the adoptions program. And so once we started looking at this data, we realized that we had about 80 children that were in this sort of long stayer status, where the family was no longer receiving reunification services, but they weren't moving towards a finalized adoption. And so what we did was pull monthly data, meet with our staff and our supervisors to identify barriers. And some of the barriers were simply that the family was delaying and moving towards an approved home study. The child had numerous placement disruptions. There were a number of different barriers, but once we were able to identify the number of children that were in this status, we were able to engage community partners and really work with staff to hold permanency roundtables, family finding, and different efforts to try to move those children towards finalization. And it's been very successful.
So what have been the barriers to that, to creating a culture that hungers for data and uses it?
I think some of the barriers have been just social workers feeling like they don't know what data means, they're not comfortable using data. And one of the things that I shared earlier was that a lot of meetings I go to where we talk about data, you frequently hear people say, I'm a social worker, I don't do math, or I'm a social worker, I'm not good at data. When in fact, data doesn't have to be that complicated, and the staff are the experts. So while we have a team of statisticians and data experts in our county, we know that without the context of what numbers mean, it's often not as powerful. So we often talk to staff about using data to be the flashlight to illuminate the issue versus the hammer to enforce change. And so I think having that balance is really important. When we first created our data unit, we only filled that unit with social workers who had a hunger for data. Now we're almost 20 years down the road, we understand that we need to have a balance. We need to have trained statisticians and epidemiologists who have skills in advanced analytics, as well as the social workers for the context.
So how do you use data to dispel myths?
I think that's a great question, and I think data can be used in many different ways to tell the story of what we do in child welfare. I think child welfare can be a system that is oftentimes misunderstood. It's very complex, and what we've seen and what we've heard is that at times there's an impression by the community that a child welfare organization's sole purpose is to disrupt families, to take children away from their parents. And when we're able to use data to speak to that, oftentimes you can see where the numbers really are. And so in our county, we receive upwards of 40,000 calls annually to our child abuse hotline, which represents over 70,000 children. And then of that number, when you look at how many are actually placed in protective custody, the number is much lower, under 1,500, I believe. And so when you're looking at the data, you're able to see that what is believed isn't actually accurate. And so I think using data gives us a great opportunity to share our story.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
So Melinda, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your why. What drew you to this work?
Well, I'm a foster parent. I have worked in community nonprofit and cross-organizational collaboratives for most of my career. And I think that really has brought me to this place. And one of the ways that I've wanted to give back to the community really happened in 2002 when I became a foster parent. For me, that was, without a doubt, the hardest thing I've ever done, and the best thing I've ever done in equal measure. Both of those things are true. And for me, in doing this work, I think it is the work not just with the kiddos that come into care, but with their families and their extended families that really lights me up, that I really have a passion for. So that's my why.
That's great. So as a leader, what has been your role in helping to create a shift in perspective or facilitate the kind of aha moments that drive a hunger for data?
Well, 2 years after I became a foster parent, I began teaching the licensing classes for prospective foster parents. And I've always felt that it's important that folks who are thinking about fostering really can hear from somebody with lived experience, hopefully lots of people with lived experience, about what fostering really means. And the opportunities for aha moments in that teaching are immense. And I think that there are times that those stories and those aha moments really lead some folks to say, this is not for me. And other times they lead folks to say, this is exactly what I want to be doing. And from my perspective, both of those outcomes are successful. You need to be well informed about what it is that you're going to be doing. And I think really understanding foster care and child welfare and what it means to bring a child and their family into your life is important if you're going to do this well.
So what steps have you taken to initiate the change that you envision for the system?
Well, you know, as I had said before, I have, my passion is really about foster parents and parents really partnering together for the best possible outcomes for children. And as a foster parent, I have really taken that conversation to the state level and been a voice to the field around why that's important. And in doing that, I think I've also gotten some other parents to really do the same thing, which has been wonderful, and to really contribute their voice to the field. And I think it's critically important. I think for me as well, I've then had an opportunity to take that onto the national level and be able to do some subject matter expert work in that way. And I think through all of those things, the strategies that I've used have really come from stories, and those stories that I've been living for the last 17 years. And the stories are important, and I think when I tell them, it's important to tell the whole story, the beginning, the middle, the end, the messy as well as the positive, because I think people need to know this is what success looks like. It isn't easy. It certainly can be messy, but here's what the outcome looks like. And I think in doing that, I'm also able to kind of sneak in some data or this idea that collecting data comes from a bunch of different places, including stories, and that qualitative data, which kind of answers the question, what does it look like? What does success look like? Is an important one. And I think for me, that's probably the place I spend the most time is with the stories. And so getting to do that at the national level is exhilarating.
That's great, but not always easy. So
No.
tell us a little bit about the barriers to creating a culture that hungers for data and uses information to make decisions.
Well, one of the things, I sort of hearken back to a job that's a bit outside of child welfare, but I've always worked in some sort of work that's about prevention, whether it's community mental health, public health, and people can really get stopped by this idea of, but how do we measure what doesn't happen? Because if we're doing our jobs well, there are hopefully things that aren't happening. And so people can really stop there and say, well, how will we even know if this works? And helping people to take that step from there to, well, here's how we know if it works. And it's going to take a while, and it's kind of longitudinal data, but we can compare a couple of years down the road how this is going to previous data. And I think that's one of the barriers. People really stop it. I don't know how to measure this. And I think the other, Margot spoke to as well, and that is that I think staff don't always see themselves as critical to the process. And I think they don't see themselves as contributors to the process. It's something other. And not only is it not something other, but as Margot said, it's the folks who are doing the work every day that are the most informed about what's going on in the field. And critical data is being collected that we need.
Right.
So,
So what are the steps that we can take to overcome some of those barriers?
One of the things that I think about when my kids were little, and each of them hit that stage of, but why? But how? And they would ask over and over and over again until they were either satisfied, or I was completely out of answers, or patience, whichever came first. And in some ways I miss those days. But at the heart of that, the why and the how, is curiosity. And I think that's what we really need to get back to. That's the gift we need to give to the field. I think as we get older, we learn more. You know, if you ask my teenagers, they know everything. But I think we learn more, and at some point, we may even begin to feel like we know enough. And of course we don't. And the truth is that there's far more we don't know than that we do. And, you know, is that an uncomfortable truth? You know, absolutely. But once we sort of accept that and accept that there's a whole bunch that we don't know, I think our curiosity kicks in. And now we do want to know why. We do want to know how. And a lot of those answers people are going to find in data, which is wonderful.
Right. Well, it's great to hear your story. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
So Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your why. What drew you to this work?
Well, I work for the Center for Native Child and Family Resilience as their Indigenous Project Program Lead, and where we're looking at cultural resilience as a way to prevent maltreatment in Indian country. The reason I got involved in child welfare is kind of a long story. I grew up in an alcoholic home. There was a lot of domestic violence. There was a lot of homelessness. And eventually, you know, I was able to go to high school and finished high school. Went into the military about a week after high school. Finished that, came back, went to school, got my criminal justice degree, and became a criminal investigator. And I was a criminal investigator in Oklahoma City for a number of years. And eventually wound up in North Dakota, where I became a CPS investigator. And so that kind of changed my whole perspective on children and families at that time. And it still does when I think back about the cases that I had. Because it made me realize that a lot of the cases or the children that I was working with at that time mirrored exactly the same thing that I was going through at their age. So that really changed my overall look at children and families. And so I've been involved in child welfare either through program evaluation or directly like providing technical assistance to child welfare programs ever since then. And so that was really a big change for me.
So as a leader, what has been your role in helping to create this shift in perspective, facilitating kind of the aha moments that drive a hunger for data?
Well, it kind of came by accident. I remember at one point in time, I was a program evaluator for a number of grant projects, most of them involving child welfare in some form or fashion. And so for one tribal child welfare program, I had conducted multiple program evaluations for that agency, various grants that they had. And so I remember one day sitting in my office kind of feeling sorry for myself because I was starting to think, well, what I'm doing is not working because I keep seeing the same organizational challenges from year to year. And it wasn't too long after that I got a call from one of the workers within that agency, and she asked me to do some analysis and prepare a PowerPoint presentation for them to present the results to their tribal council. And what was going on is that she had created a survey on her own with somebody from the community. And within this community, they had cluster housing. And the cluster housing had anywhere from 15 to 20 houses within each one of those areas. And they were about 10 miles from all the services. So if you didn't have an automobile to get to your child welfare appointments, to your unemployment visits, you would somewhat be doomed because you would miss those appointments, and generally your unemployment would stop, and whatever you had been doing with the child welfare agency, that would come back to negatively impact you. And so anyway, she asked, they had developed that survey, they administered that survey, I did the analysis for them, and then I created the PowerPoint and helped them present the information to the tribal council, and the result was that they got a van from the tribe and a fuel card to allow the residents in that cluster housing area to make their appointments on time. And the aha moment for me was when I realized that the worker at the child welfare agency understood the power of data and how to utilize data to get your needs met. So.
It's such a great story. So what steps have you taken to initiate the changes that you envision for the child welfare system or for families?
Just trying to be as clear as I possibly can be whenever I'm out meeting with them, because I sat there thinking about that experience I told you about a few minutes ago, and why it took so long, because it was numerous years before she actually was able to see the power of data and how to collect that. It took me a while to discover that, well, maybe I wasn't being as clear as I should be. Maybe everybody wasn't on the same page. I had to make sure that program leadership understood exactly what everybody was doing and what their role consisted of in that. And so that was the thoughts that I had regarding why it took so long. And so that's what I started doing, and I still do that today with everything, not only program evaluation, but every time I go out and meet with program staff or even families. Sometimes I'll do community meetings. I just make sure that I'm as transparent as possible and that everybody's on the same page.
So what have been the barriers to creating and supporting a culture that hungers for data?
Well, I think I talked a little bit about that earlier in one of my presentations, and that is usually the child welfare program staff are overwhelmed. They have multiple roles that they're responsible for. Sometimes there's not enough staff, not enough funding to hire additional staff. And there may be something as simple as the staff feeling like, well, if you conduct an evaluation, if you start gathering data, is it going to paint me in a bad light? You know, and so do I really want to answer those kind of questions? And so you just try to overcome that to make sure that everybody's comfortable.
So what do you think would change the story and create kind of the aha moments for others around valuing data?
I think it's as simple as everyone understanding how the power of data and how it can help you. How it can help you personally, how it can help you in your job, how it can help you make appropriate changes for your child welfare agency. I think as long as everybody understands that, then it'll turn out for the better for their agency.
Well, it's great to hear your story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Thank you.
So Jerry, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your why. What drew you to this work?
Okay, I'm Jerry Bruce. I'm the Court Improvement Program Director for the state of Georgia. Before that, I was a juvenile court judge, and a long time ago, I was a prosecutor in a small rural county, several small rural counties in North Georgia. And I had to cover all the jurisdictions that we practiced in front of, including juvenile court. A lot of prosecutors don't like to go to juvenile court because it's not the sort of classy stuff that you see in adult criminal court, jury trials and flamboyant crimes and things like that. But I noticed very quickly something about juvenile court, which was that rather than just being a sort of conveyor belt of defendants over and over and over again, that there was actually a real potential for change. And I realized two important things. One, that people have a really remarkable capacity to change. Sometimes they need help changing, and that we have a remarkable capacity to help people change. And so I left the district attorney's office to become Special Assistant Attorney General representing our state child welfare agency, and because I saw juvenile court as a place where we could really help people to change. And so that's my constant motivation, is that we have the ability to help people change. We can help people change, and we do.
So as a leader, talk a little bit about your role in helping to create kind of the shift in perspective, facilitating the aha moments that drive a hunger for data.
So the way it works in Georgia is that our agency actually has no authority whatsoever. We just have we have responsibility, but we have no authority. So I see my job as trying to raise awareness about issues and building personal relationships so that there's a trust with the person giving the information, and then working on solutions to those issues. So one of the ways that I try and work these solutions out is by saying the same thing over and over and over again to people in different contexts. And one of those things, I'll give you an example. So it looked like from our data, and we do a lot of data work in Georgia, we're very heavily dependent on data. It looked like from our data that we were overusing terminations of parental rights because we were putting kids into termination situations and then not getting them to permanency afterwards, which made us question the rationale. So why are we terminating parental rights if we're not getting kids to permanency afterwards? And I realized a couple of things. The first was that we don't really, there's a statutory prioritization for reunification, but we don't really like reunification. I've done a lot of adoption day celebrations, and it's really good. I'm adopted, so I'm a big fan of adoption. I think it's a great thing. But I realized that we celebrate adoption. People take pictures and they send them to everybody. So we've adopted a child. We don't celebrate reunification, and a lot of times we do reunification with our teeth gritted. And people, the only time I ever had to have somebody removed from my courtroom by a deputy was after announcing that we were going to be doing a reunification and the child was going to go home with the parent that day. That sort of thing doesn't happen in adoption court. That's because we don't trust reunification. And one of the reasons we don't trust reunification is that we do a really bad job at reunification. That's an aha moment for me. And here's an example. So substance abuse is a common denominator for dependency cases across our country, and it's a common denominator in termination of parental rights cases. And substance abuse is eminently treatable. When you take the top 4 diseases that require some type of medical intervention along with behavioral change, you're looking at type 1 diabetes, hypertension, asthma, and substance abuse. And the relapse rates for all of those except for asthma are higher than the relapse rates for substance abuse. And when people do relapse, when they have hypertension or diabetes, we don't say, oh, well, your treatment was a failure. We say things like, well, what kind of dosage are we using? What kind of behaviors do you have, and how can we tailor our dosage and therapy and frequency of treatment to match your behavioral needs? But we don't do that with substance abuse issues in juvenile courts. We say, oh, your treatment failed, sorry, we're going to terminate your parental rights. And we add to that the fact that, at least in Georgia, most parents who are dealing with substance abuse and have lost their children because of substance abuse issues actually don't receive evidence-based treatment. They get a treatment frequency and modality that has no scientific basis behind it. Except in the jurisdictions, I think it's a few jurisdictions in our state where we have family treatment courts now, where they do get 18 to 24 months of extremely intensive evidence-based treatment. Outside of those jurisdictions, they don't get it. And we terminate their parental rights when they fail to change, and we haven't done anything to help them change. So that's a real aha moment for me. A lot of we rely heavily on termination of parental rights, but we often create the conditions that lead to termination of parental rights.
So you described that you were drawn to this work by a belief in change. What steps have you taken to initiate the changes that you envision for the system?
Well, one thing is to take these messages to people and to show the data that back them up, and to show that we can really change outcomes, and to engage people in this process. One of the hardest things to do with professionals who are all intelligent and well-educated is to get them to think about the fact that the way they do and think may be limited or incorrect. And so that's that's our job, and that's the hardest thing. But that's what we do, is try to engage. It's a process of engagement.
And what have been the barriers to creating a culture that hungers for data or values data?
Well, the barriers are that sometimes data are unpleasant. Right? Sometimes you go to the doctor and you say, I feel great, and the doctor says, I got bad news for you, right? But you can't get better until the doctor says, here's the bad news. So I do a lot of data presentations, and I really enjoy them, and I do them in Georgia and across the country. And I was doing one not very long ago where I had to report really bad data outcomes. And it was really rough because I had a judge there and community leaders and others, and I had to say, this looks really, really bad. But the spin I put on it was, this means that we can now have something to work towards. We can plan on how to get better and how we're going to address this. And in fact, we brought together all the people who were there and came to an agreement about how to proceed and how to make things work better. So it can be uncomfortable, but it's a discomfort that can lead to much better outcomes.
So any other thoughts on how you overcome those barriers, people, whether they be resistance to hearing bad news or?
I think one of the things that I use this medical analogy all the time, and it is, we know, for instance, that a lot of people don't take the medications that they're prescribed in the way they're supposed to. And there seems to be this sort of psychological research that shows that people don't believe they're really worthy of being helped. But they do think that other people are worthy of being helped. And what we have to realize in this child welfare system is that if I don't look at the data, if I am not cognizant of the things that I'm doing, I'm not just hurting myself, I'm taking down the entire system with me. And so if I'm a judge or an attorney or an agency worker, then I have to realize that my lack of the ability to confront the reality that's out there is going to hurt everybody. And in the end, it's going to hurt the families and children who are on the receiving end of our services. And so that should be a motivating factor, is, hey, this isn't just me, this is all of us together.
It's great to hear your perspective and experience. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
So now we're going to have an opportunity to talk to all of our panelists together and consider some of the commonalities and differences in the strategies that you all have talked about. So several of you talked about helping people to see their role in contributing to the bigger picture. So really thinking about what leaders can do to drive the curiosity for answering the why from youth, families, stakeholders, and system partners and staff at all levels. So Jerry, tell us a little bit about what's sparking this curiosity in Georgia.
I think I talked a little bit earlier about some really intensive trainings that we're providing in local jurisdictions. It's one thing to have everybody in the state come to a general convening and talk about generalities, but it's completely different when you have all the stakeholders, judges, and everyone together in one room for 2 days, and you say, these are the best practices. This is your data. This is what you actually do. How can we make these two things look more like one another? And what people realize is that they have the capacity to really make a major impact on the outcomes of these cases. They weren't all exactly the kinds of cases they thought they were, perhaps. And they realize, we've seen people get more motivated to be more involved in the work they do because they realize the impact that they can have.
So others of you have noted that data can also present a possibility for discomfort, and that leadership needs to be comfortable with that discomfort, that's critical to driving this cultural change. So I'm sure you've all been in that uncomfortable position of sharing either negative data or data that contradicts beliefs that are, deeply held. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, for tribal nations, because of the historical context of evaluation occurring over the years, and it may not have the tribes may not have been told exactly what the evaluation would collect, and then they find out later after reports are written that that probably wasn't as honest as it should have been about what the nature of the evaluation project and what it was going to collect and the possible results and the expectations and those sort of things. That's one of the things that tribes look at and make sure that they fully understand what the evaluation is going to collect, who has access, who owns the data, that sort of thing. It's even to a point right now through the center where I work, where our teaming agreement talks about data management. And it talks about it in a way that they almost tell us exactly what they want their evaluation to look like. and what the results should look like, or the expected results, and we'll develop an evaluation based upon their wishes. Where it didn't used to be like that, but it is now. It's starting to turn in that direction.
You all have such a depth of child welfare experience from different perspectives, and we want to bring these voices together to talk about how and where to begin shifting the culture. So Margot, let's start with you. You talked about the data sessions that you have with staff and how you use data to dispel myths about child protective services. What do you believe has been the key to these strategies being effective for you?
Well, I think in order to make anything effective, you have to first get buy-in. And so the data sessions with staff involve bringing people together to make sure that we're actually entering data into a system that can then capture it and provide reports. That's our first step to be able to tell how we're doing. And so I think for us, really involving all levels of staff, creating that environment, and then helping them understand the purpose. I think as leaders, I mentioned this earlier, the further you get away from the practice, it's harder to understand the barriers. And so you really need to have line level staff that can help you and give context to what the data is that you're looking at.
So how about you, Melinda? What in your experience has been key to the effectiveness of the strategies you talked to us about?
Well, I think for me, whether I've been working with child welfare professionals or foster parents or families, it really has come down to giving people permission to sort of say that they don't know what they don't know, and also giving people permission and honoring the fact that they have a lot to learn. And they have a lot to teach. I have yet to meet anyone that hasn't taught me a lesson. And sometimes I didn't even know I needed that particular lesson. But I think that is really important. Being open to those lessons, I think once we can sort of say, I've got a lot to learn, then I am coming from a place of being really open to those lessons, and it's a really good first step. And I think once you open that door, then things like data and evidence-based practice and evidence-based policy, all of those things start to make sense because it's about what we all need to learn together.
So Joe, same question for you. Tell us a little bit about what's contributed to the effectiveness of your strategy.
I think it's been the transparent nature of our work with tribes, that they understand everything that we're going to do, that they understand the expectations of the evaluation or the research or whatever it happens to be. I think it's the realization by frontline staff that they can be as honest as they possibly can be to talk about the positive and negatives of the, about what's occurring with their child welfare program. So I think overall, it's just the transparency of what's going on and what's going to happen.
And Jerry, what about you? What are things that have been critical to the success of the strategies you talked about?
It's related to the things I talked about earlier. It's giving people the tools to understand that they can really make change. And I'll give one quick example is that we've always prided ourselves on being a state that prioritizes kinship placements and continuing family connections. But data repeatedly showed us that more kids aged out of care every year than went into permanent guardianship, which is the permanent placement that actually keeps those types of things alive. And we began just to point this out again and again and again, not in a sort of threatening bad way, but to say, look, here's a way that we can preserve these connections that we say are so important. And what's preventing us from doing this? It turns out that our state child welfare agency had a policy that actually prohibited them from agreeing to do these things. We got rid of that policy, and now for the first time ever, our permanent guardianships are outstripping our kids aging out of care. So, and that's a really great outcome, and people can feel good about that. So that's a way to get people engaged.
Wow. Okay, so let's dig a little bit more into understanding how we know that the strategies we're using to change the culture are working. So Joe, in your work with tribes, what have been some of the early indicators that you've seen, those incremental changes that help drive the culture for seeing data as a tool and a support for long-term sustainable
I think
change?
a lot of it has to do with conducting a lot of program evaluations with the various tribal projects that we had at that time. Talking about the same thing over and over again, essentially just hammering the need for data and what data can do for you and those sorts of things. And so that led into the ease of developing what we called a cultural subcommittee that reviewed all of the questionnaires that we utilized to collect information from the various projects. There was also one of the indicators was the ease in which people stepped up from the staff in those tribal projects to become local evaluators in their communities. So there's probably a lot of different things that I'm just not seeing, but those are a couple of the most important aspects of that.
So how about you, Melinda? What have been some of the incremental changes that you've seen that are shifting the culture towards seeing data as tools to support family outcomes?
Well, I did some work with the state that was really wanting to focus on building, creating foster parent relationships, really having them work in partnership, kind of right up my alley. And as I worked with that state, we did a theory of change, and we, in our theory of change, one of the things that we hoped to change was that placement permanency would improve, so there would be fewer placement disruptions. And we had a number of other indicators. There was some pushback about the project in general, that it would work, but at its heart, it was really putting birth parents and foster parents in the same room within 10 days of a child coming into care, and really planting the seed to begin to build those relationships. And as we began to pilot this, we asked people to bring stories back. How has it been going? Tell us what's happening. And in one case, we had the foster family, a foster parent, that it took in 2 preschool children. They were siblings, and she called Child Welfare and said, I can't keep the little boy. I just don't feel like I'm the right person, and I'm not sure how to handle him, so you need to find another placement. While they were doing that, this meeting happened, this meeting between the parents and the foster parent. And at the end of that meeting, she went to that same caseworker and said, I really understand this kiddo a whole lot better, so please don't look for another placement. And what we were able to talk about in that group was, so we're not going to know if this is a real outcome across the state, but what we can say is here is a great example of one child whose placement was not disrupted because the parent and the foster parent really worked together.
That really emphasizes the value of that qualitative data, the story of an individual child or family. So Margot, tell us what incremental changes you've seen in shifting the data culture in your agency.
Well, I think what we've done is really to kind of piggyback on what Joe had said is evaluation is key, right? And Jerry had mentioned it earlier. Sometimes in child welfare, you don't really know what's working, and you keep hoping that you're doing the right thing and plodding along. And so we've really shifted in our county to conduct evaluations of best practices that we believe to be working. We've also reached out and created partnerships with the local universities to really help the research, the evidence research drive some of our practices. And that's been extremely effective in coming up with new ways to look at a system that really needs to be in constant change. I think lastly, our use of our continuous quality improvement, the key word there being continuous. I think we're never done learning and growing in child welfare, and our staff know that we continue to evolve, and that's important.
Mm-hmm. So Jerry, in Georgia, the strategies have really changed the data partnership between the courts and the Child Welfare Agency. Can you tell us what incremental changes you're seeing that are driving that culture shift in Georgia to one that hungers for data or sees it as a support?
So I talked about some of the specific programs and initiatives and conversations that we have, but what we look at in the end is data is not just a conversation starter, and it's not just a way to diagnose problems, but it's also a really good indicator of the kind of changes that are being brought about. So we've seen a recent reduction in our overall foster care population. We've seen a drop in the average time that kids spend in care when they come into foster care. We've seen fewer terminations of parental rights and a growth in guardianship. So we're starting to be able to look at the data objectively and measure, I think, what's a real success. And that's all because we've started really looking objectively at our data and taking it to heart and making conscious decisions about how to proceed in light of what the data show us.
So it's been great to talk to you all together. We've learned so much from your stories today. I just want to highlight the focus on developing curiosity for how data impacts the work that we do every day, from frontline staff to supervisors and administrators to families across our systems. Also digging in and connecting with the data and connecting it to those who need it, the problems they're focused on solving, partnering hand in hand to ensure that the data that's collected represents the need in the field and that we make meaning of it in a way that is valid and relevant. And then also the relationships across all the levels of an agency or a program and all the system partners and how important it is to build and really sustain those partnerships. So thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we heard some great stories today about how leaders engage with data and evidence and how they influence the systems they're in to do the same. And I want to just highlight 3 of the things that I think we all have in common. One is that we all see opportunities for improvement. We believe that we can do better, that our parents can do better, that systems can do better. And data exploration always begins with identifying a problem. So among us, you've heard examples of the types of problems that we're all trying to solve, such as lengthy stays, inefficient processes, unmet service needs, separated siblings, or poorly prepared foster parents. And using data and information to highlight those problems and understand what we might be able to do to address them is part of what we talked about today. The second thing is that none of us shy away from challenges, that part of this cultural shift is in embracing the challenges that we see, seeking them out, confronting them. Accurate information brings about the best decisions. So whether it's the decision to be a foster parent or a system leader's decision about which issues to prioritize, we get this from the data and information that we seek. And the third thing is that we believe in the importance of engaging all of our system partners, especially our experts, who we see as frontline staff and parents and families. And this means engaging them in making meaning through interpretation. It means modeling curiosity and agility in response to data that don't always tell us what we expect them to, and not shying away from bad news. So I just want to remind you that the handouts are available for downloading in the handout window. And thank you for joining us in this session. We hope to see you in the next session.